you'll have a little bit more. No, no, no. Those will be the presentation days.
or edits or changes anyone like to make that? If none, again, seeking a motion to approve. Motion?
Second.
Motion and second. Signify by raising your right hand, please. Next up on the agenda is public comments. Ms. Smith, anyone sign up?
No public comments.
Having no comments, we'll move on to new business. Again, today's agenda is to discuss the accommodation tax and how that lives and breathes. I'd like to welcome Mr. Josh Gruber, Deputy Town Manager, and he's going to give us some useful information and overview of the accommodation. Welcome.
All right. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the Accommodations Tax Advisory Committee. It is a lovely day today.
Good morning.
Excited to be here, have a conversation with y'all, provide you with some information, some background, and at any point in time, if you have questions, please just stop us, let us know, and that way we can get you information and response. I know sometimes if you have to hold that to the end, it can be hard to keep that thought when you're processing so much information. So please, by any means, just speak up and let us know anytime you have a question. We are going to tag team our presentation this morning. So I, along with a couple colleagues, are going to go over various bits of information that we think are going to be helpful to you as you undertake your service as a member of this body. And so one of the first things we want to do is really do a brief overview of the information that we're going to cover with you today. So first and foremost, we're going to go over the ATAX advisory role and responsibilities, where some of that comes from, both within state law and within town code. We're also going to talk about the committee bylaws and rules of procedure. Those are formal documents that have been adopted to guide this body as it undertakes its work. You're going to hear from the town attorney. He's going to talk to you about the South Carolina Freedom of Information Act. Now that you are serving as a public official on a public body, you get to be subject to this act along with the rest of us on staff. And so we want to make sure you're aware of what that means, what those regulations are, and kind of what you can and can't do so that we don't run afoul of that act. You're then going to hear from our finance director, who's going to talk to you about distribution of state ATAX dollars, some of those historical lookbacks about how the committee has previously gone about making recommendations, where those have gone, and how that plays into the overall process with council. We're also going to talk about prior ATAX committee recommendations, and then we're going to look forward at your upcoming schedule. So the dates that are currently on the calendar in terms of when you're going to do certain actions, when you're going to review applications, and ultimately when you're going to make a recommendation that'll go to town council for their consideration. And so again, at any point in time you have any questions, just speak up and let us know, but that's kind of an overview of what we're going to hope to cover with you today. All right, so let's jump into what is an accommodations tax. So in South Carolina, there are actually two accommodations taxes. And so we have to be careful and speak with a little bit of specificity when we are talking about accommodations taxes. So one is a state accommodations tax. And that is probably the most important for you and your service on this board, because that is really what you're going to focus on in terms of making recommendations, are the expenditures of state accommodations tax revenues. And just to give you an idea, local governments are also empowered, if they so choose, to adopt a local accommodations tax. And Hilton Head has, in fact, enacted such a local accommodations tax. While they are very, very similar, both are a tax on overnight or transient accommodations, the distribution of revenues under the local accommodations tax does not flow through this body. That is something that is strictly held by town council as part of their annual budgeting process. And just for your information, the way that the town has typically approached that is they've split that 3% into two buckets. One is a true 1% local accommodations tax, which goes to fund various tourism-related expenditures, and the 2% is what we call the beach preservation fee. It's still a tax, but we call it a beach preservation fee, and those revenues are typically dedicated towards beach renourishment efforts, beach improvements, capital projects that are all beach-related. So, focusing on the state accommodation tax, which is a 2% tax on the rental or charges for any rooms, campground spaces, lodging, sleeping accommodations furnished to transients by any hotel, inn, tourist camp, motel, campground, etc. Again, a tax on overnight accommodations. So if I come and I rent a hotel room on Hilton Head Island, On my bill, I'm going to see several different tax items. One is the state's general sales tax, which is 6%. The state then imposes an additional accommodations tax beyond the 2%. Ultimately, when you add all that together, it ends up being close to, I believe, somewhere around 11 or 12% in terms of the taxes that are collected on those overnight accommodations. And so again, for purposes of this body, we're going to focus on that state accommodations tax and the 2% revenues that you help advise on how should be spent. Within state law, there is a requirement that any municipality receiving more than $50,000 in revenue from this 2% state accommodations tax must appoint an advisory committee, yourselves, to make recommendations on how this revenue should be spent. It then goes on to provide information on what the committee should be made up of, which is no less than 7 members. That at least 2 of those members should be from the hospitality industry. 1 should represent cultural organizations. And again, you all know your backgrounds. You've been through the process about how you got selected and put on here, so you kind of generally know what it is in terms of being a representative on this board and what that means in terms of your background. So, the role of this committee is to look at various requests for funding from this 2% state accommodations tax revenue, to vet those requests, and to ultimately develop a recommendation for consideration by the town council. So, while you serve a very important focus in terms of reviewing information, gathering data, and ultimately putting together a recommendation, it is still just that. It is a recommendation. And what that means is that town council has the ability to either accept it, to reject it, or to modify it. And that is left to them in terms of their authority. But ultimately, the reason they're putting you on this body is because they want to rely upon your opinions in terms of providing them with guidance on how this information should be spent. And I highlight that to say, if you look back historically in terms of what this body has recommended and ultimately the actions that have been taken by town council, many, many times the recommendations coming out of this body are accepted by council. But it doesn't mean that they may not be modified ultimately by some degree or in some manner by the time they ultimately award funds. So please know that's not personal to this group in terms of if you make a recommendation but council ultimately amends it, that is not a slight against you or any of the work that you've done. It's just left to them to ultimately make that decision, and they take into account a number of other factors outside of just the applicant's request and kind of vetting those requests. Let's talk about a little bit how this money gets distributed, because it's set forth in state law, and you hear a couple of other things as part of this process. And so I think it's a good idea to understand really how this funding gets distributed. So what it says is that the first $25,000 of the state accommodations tax revenue is provided to the city's or municipality's general fund. So that money comes in and goes straight into the general fund and is budgeted as part of operating expenses. The next 5% as well goes into the town's general fund. Beyond that, the next 30% goes towards what's called a destination marketing organization, a DMO. That is an entity that's set forth within state law that says that entity is going to take those revenues and they're going to use it exclusively for tourism and marketing efforts to bring people within this community. I can tell you that the thought behind that is this program should be somewhat of a revolving circle. People stay here, they spend the tax, the money is used to advertise to bring them here. When they get here, they spend the tax, the money's here to advertise, and it goes in a circular fashion. And so within state law, 30% of the balance by law has to go directly to the DMO for tourism and marketing purposes. If you take 30% and add 5% and subtract that from 100, what's left then is 65%. And that's really where you all come in, because that 65% is where you have the ability to make recommendations, understanding some of the other things that town council has set forth in terms of their priorities. And so when you get into looking at how those 65% funds can be spent, you see that the statute outlines a number of different areas where those funds may lawfully be spent. And so you've got A through H. And actually, there's even more now since Act 57 of 2023 was passed, which provides for workforce housing. So we're going to cover that here in a minute. but I can tell you that this is now even more extensive than what it was previously. What I want to focus on, at least initially, is sections A and sections B. By and large, those are the types of applications that you're going to see coming before you for this funding. So it's advertising and tourism promotion to develop and increase tourist attendance through publicity and arts and cultural event promotions. And those of you that have served on this body understand the nature of those requests really kind of fall in line with A and B. When you look at C, D, E, those all really deal with capital projects. So construction of facilities, building buildings, investing in infrastructure that helps to drive tourism, but that really is a function of town council and is budgeted for through our capital improvement program process. And I want to differentiate that because you'll see when we start looking at the numbers, the 65% funds that come in, a portion of that is going to be available to provide grants under A and B, but a portion of that is also used by town council to help facilitate these types of items as well. And so just know that that funding does get divvied up amongst those different types of uses in two separate processes. So, I mentioned workforce housing, and in 2023, the General Assembly adopted Act 57, which was signed into law by the governor. And what that essentially said was, it was an understanding that tourism revenues generated within communities could have an impact on the availability of workforce housing, specifically short-term rentals by and large. They've had a correlating effect to the availability of affordable housing within different jurisdictions. And so the General Assembly said it is permissible to take a portion of your accommodations tax revenue, both state and local, and use that portion of revenue towards workforce housing initiatives. Now, they did put conditions on it, so you can see that right now 15% is the cap that can be used from either one of these sources of revenue for the purpose of workforce housing. In addition, they also set guidelines on the types of projects that could be used and the duration that this legislation will remain in place. They put what's called a sunset clause. So it is in place for 7 years, beginning last year, so it'll be in place for several more. But absent additional action by the General Assembly, at a certain point in time, this will expire and will go away unless they extend it. And I highlight this to say because this, again, is capital projects. This is not something that this committee is going to be charged with taking up or making recommendations on. That is going to be something that town council will take up with regards to its capital projects or partnerships that it may look to do with other organizations. If you've heard about the North Point Public-Private Partnership, which the town's been working on for a couple of years, that's an example of the type of partnership that the town may explore in order to facilitate the development of qualified workforce housing. All right, so let's talk about when you go to make your recommendations, what guideposts do you need to operate within? And where that comes from is, I'm sorry, this is still on workforce housing. This is not on Turk. So I'll tell you that this was one of the requirements that in order to utilize funds for workforce housing matters, this was a prerequisite that local governments needed to put in place, which was develop some data through a housing analysis and then incorporate that information into the jurisdiction's comprehensive plan so that it wasn't piecemealed. It was something that was part of a cohesive strategy to focus on workforce housing development. Both of these things have been completed by the town of Hilton Head, and so therefore it is possible for the town council to appropriate funds using either state or local tax revenue for workforce housing purposes. All right, so let's talk about now what the other things are with local. With local accommodations tax revenue, you'll see it still says tourism-related expenditures, and most of these are in keeping with the state accommodations tax. So tourism-related buildings, cultural access, beach access, highways, roads, advertisements, promotions, tourism. Again, your job is to help appropriate funds under state A tax. Local A tax is exclusively under the purview of the town council. So when you hear accommodations tax, know there's 3 different taxes that we're talking about, state and local. All right, so again, with developing workforce housing, this was a pre-element. We've already covered that. So uses of local A tax, $900,000 in state accommodations tax may be used for operational expenses. So a lot of times, if you look at the town's budget and some of the money that we use for supporting operations like our fire and rescue services. The reason for that is because we collect more than $900,000 in state accommodations taxes, we can use a portion of those revenues to support operational expenditures that are directly related to serving tourists. And so if you think about when we receive a call for a medical event or a fire event, a certain portion of those are going to come from tourists. And so because we have data showing those proportions, we are allowed to use a portion of the state accommodations tax revenue to support operations like our fire and rescue services. And so when you start looking at, okay, if we collect this much money, but a portion goes here and a portion goes here, and a portion is going to go to capital projects and a portion is going to go to operating, I'm trying to paint the picture of what will be left for this committee to focus on in terms of making its recommendations. And that way, if you have any questions about, well, we collected this, but we're only being given authority to recommend this, you understand why those funding sources are being allocated in different directions. And it's pursuant to the provisions of state law. So before we go into the review of the bylaws and rules of procedure, which I'm going to turn it over to the town attorney here in just a minute, I mentioned the guideposts that you have in terms of making recommendations. And I want to touch on that just for a little bit so that you understand what information we do have and maybe even more importantly, what information we don't have. So the state accommodations tax is required to be spent on tourism-related expenditures. That is defined in state law, and you saw some of those A through H elements of what is defined as a tourism-related expenditure, although sometimes different projects don't fall very neatly within one of those categories. So there's a state board called the Tourism Expenditure Review Committee. And this is a group of individuals that's appointed at the state level whose job it is to review the appropriations by county and local governments and make sure that those appropriations remain in line with tourism-related expenditures. It used to be that they would provide formal opinions on what that guidance would be. An example would be, yes, it's okay to spend money to install landscaping as part of an entranceway to your municipality because that's where tourists are going to come through. But you can't spend that same money on maintaining those plants once you've put them on the ground because that's an operational expenditure that's outside the scope of what's allowed for in the statute. Now, the Tourism Expenditure Review Committee has stated, well, that's essentially us giving legal advice, and we are not attorneys, and so we can't do that. So what they'll say is, we'll tell you if it's a problem, but we can't tell you if it's a problem until after you've already done it. And so I think it's an important thing to highlight because sometimes we just don't know exactly. So there are things that we can do. One is to look back at prior opinions from the Tourism Expenditure Review Committee back when they used to give those to get an idea about how they viewed those things. Others are to look at something like the State Attorney General's office. Maybe we need to ask them for their opinion on how this would be looked at. But just know that that body is out there to review these expenditures to make sure that they stay in line with what the statute requires, but they no longer give as much direct guidance on how to go about that as they used to. But town staff is here, the town attorney's here, and that's really to help you in making those decisions if you ever have any question about something along those lines. So based upon that information in terms of the role of the committee, what the statutes say in terms of state and local A tax, and ultimately leading up to how this committee is going to function, are there any questions that I can answer about that before I turn it over to Mr. Coltrane? Yes, sir.
If you're looking at the up to 15% for housing that can be taken, does the town have to have a plan for that money, or can they just take the 15% every year regardless of whether they have a plan to spend it or they have a, I mean, I know we have North Point right now, but if we have nothing in the line, then where's that money going and what is it doing?
So there are restrictions in terms of the time that we can have accommodations tax revenues in our possession. And so we do have to spend those, but we typically do that on a first in, first out basis. So if we receive $5 million in revenue one year and $7 million the next, but appropriate $5 million, the first $5 million of that $7 million came in is going out the door when they make that appropriation. And then next year, the first $2 million is going to be from that $7 million. And I want to say it's a 2-year requirement in terms of having to have those monies expended. At this point, we've budgeted for various funds within our accommodations tax program to set aside for workforce housing that are being directed towards the North Point Public-Private Partnership as an example, and as well as a couple of other initiatives that town council is currently talking about. So to answer your question, yes, there is a timing component to it, but that is typically provided for within council's budgeting from one year to the next for its capital projects.
But town council does not have to have a certain plan, or town government doesn't have to have a certain plan to take that 15% to begin with?
Correct. No, the 15% is just a cap. That is the most that they can allocate towards that particular undertaking.
Do you foresee the town taking that 15% every year?
That's going to be a policy decision of the town council that is part of their annual budget adoption. They'll take up that question about how much up to that 15% cap do they want to use towards that purpose.
Okay, my other question would be, out of the local accommodations tax monies, is any of that spent on land purchase?
It certainly can be. I think we had a slide on there that talked about what those eligible expenditures were. Let's get back here. There we go. So local accommodation tax purposes, expenditures, tourism-related buildings, including but not limited to civic centers, coliseums, aquarium, cultural, recreational, historic facilities, beach access, beach renourishment, tourism-related lands and water access. So obviously within all of those, there's the ability to acquire land as part of one of those tourism-related undertakings.
And once they acquire that land, it would have to be under this criteria, so it can only be recreational, historic.
Correct. Generally speaking, it's going to have to remain in that. I will tell you, as long as it's publicly owned and publicly utilized, you're not likely to run afoul of any of those concerns.
Could that land be used for housing?
At this point, housing is not listed on here. I would say that if you're going to acquire property specifically for housing, you should identify it to the 15% funds that are within the Act 57 enabling legislation.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
I have a question also, Mr. Gruber. Can you go back to that slide that had the A through E on the different buckets, I guess, that would fall under consideration for support?
There we go.
So you mentioned that A and B were basically the ones that we see. It's a high percentage of what we see in the form of an application, and they're for promotion. And for after it's spent, we offset the cost. They have to spend it first.
That's it. So the way that this is set up, a lot of these are reimbursable. Right. So you basically spend the money, you show what you spent it on, and then you get reimbursed through these funds after the fact.
Then you mentioned that C, D, and E are predominantly capital spends, and and that they have an opportunity to make application for support from another entity.
Well, I would say you're not likely to get a lot of applications under C, D, and E just because that's going to be outside of what this body typically recommends. Where you see that, though, is if, and I'm just going to use hypothetical examples, if the town collects $10 million in accommodations tax revenue, 30% goes to the DMO, that's $6 million that's left. $2 million of that may go to support fire and rescue operations. $2 million of that may go to support capital projects. And then the remaining $2 million are what would be left for this committee to consider primarily with regards to A and B.
I'm just thinking for the sake of the folks in the audience here, if they're going to have a better chance of, when they do have the need for a capital spend, is it best that they make their application through us or through another?
I would say it's best to make that through the town council, because ultimately all capital projects through the town are within our capital improvement program, and that is handled directly through the budgeting of town council.
So it would be beneficial to them if they do have a capital spend they need for lighting for the dance theater.
So capital is typically going to be land acquisition, construction of facilities. It won't necessarily be equipment per se. It certainly could be under certain circumstances. But again, I think a lot of times what you're going to see and what is put out in the application material to applicants are, let's focus on using those funds to support advertising and promotion of whatever event, whatever organization you may have, or let's look at supporting the event itself, which could be inclusive of providing certain services or providing certain equipment.
Okay, so it's recommended but not required that it be.
I would tell you that if you want town council to take up your recommendations, I would not look at getting in this area of C, D, and E, because that's something that they treat very separately in creating a 5-year CIP plan. And it's not just, hey, we've got some money, we're going to fund you this year, but not next year. It is a completely different animal, which is why I'm kind of trying to steer you away from that.
Okay.
If I could follow up that question with, if you're finished.
I am.
We've had previous applicants apply for grants that are dealing with maintenance or construction in the past. So the recommendation is that they would not apply to this body, that they should make their applications to town council.
Yes, I think they'd have a better chance of being funded by making the recommendation through town council just because of that very regimented CIP program. And again, when it comes to maintenance, I mentioned something along the lines of there was a prior tourism expenditure review committee that said maintenance is not an eligible expense for these tourism-related things. You can build things, you can advertise things, but you can't use this to offset operational costs above and beyond what's allowed for supporting tourist activities.
What would the recommendation be from town staff if we do get an applicant through this cycle that is applying for our construction grants?
I would say that it's likely outside of what this committee typically takes up, but if they want to send that request directly to the town, we're always willing to receive it. We'll share it directly with the mayor and town council, and if they think it's appropriate, then we can figure out a way to incorporate that into our capital improvement program budget. But again, you have to be careful in terms of this is a specific source of revenue. If you wanted to come in and say, hey, I want to build a new facility because I think it would be a great thing to have here and it would support this wonderful organization, as a private entity, it can be difficult to get public funds outside of this area. And as I think you're going to see when our finance director talks to you, between making recommendations on these grants and between the town budgeting for these funds, there's really not a lot of additional funding that's not otherwise provided for. So if an entity was going to come in and say, hey, I want to get funded for some building that you're going to build for me, that would be a really difficult process for them to take up without having to probably take funding away for some other area, which again is a policy question left to town council, but something that they would have to figure out if that's what they wanted to pursue.
Josh, can I ask you, the way that money is usually spent is on town capital improvements though, right?
It is.
So, I mean, traditionally, it hasn't been spent, for example, if the Gullah Museum wanted to build something there, that money has not been spent that way in the past.
Not historically,
So
no.
you're saying that now those sort of improvements would not go through us, or?
What I want to say is I want to categorically exclude them. Submit your request and we can review and vet it. But it's not historically been funded because typically that money is used for public facilities because those are unequivocally open to the public, whereas the Gullah Museum is privately owned and privately operated. And so that can potentially create some problems, but I don't want to categorically say don't make a request if you have a request.
So in instances like that, they should still submit an application for capital improvements.
Again, I would recommend that they submit a request to the town to fund whatever capital improvement they're looking for, not through this body, because ultimately this body's recommendation is going to go right to the same place, which is town council.
But wouldn't recommendations of A and B be the same thing? They're just recommendations of town council. And I'm going back to, for the past several years, we've had a number of applicants that are doing construction or maintenance. I think of one in particular that has received recommendations in a large sum, and they've accomplished those goals. It seems like we're kind of being directed to stay away from C a little bit as a recommendation, because it's going to go through town council and they have to approve it. So why even?
Yeah, and that's really, I think, the takeaway is that if you're talking about building buildings, I would not recommend that comes through this body. That's something that really should just go straight to town council, be a conversation with them because of how it would need to be incorporated within the CIP program.
Can some of those capital improvements come out of the other local A-tax monies too, or no?
It would depend upon the nature of the application. So again, I don't want to tell anybody, don't apply. If you have a question, bring it up, let's look at it, let's vet it. But in terms of what applicants should be submitting to this body, it is my recommendation that they stay kind of around this area. And you'll see that in terms of the majority of application requests that you receive.
Yeah, I'm just thinking because we have had some worthy capital improvement applications that I wouldn't want to be overlooked, and town council isn't always at our meetings, so they would not be aware if we can't recommend that.
Which is why my recommendation is encourage them to contact town council directly with that request.
Okay.
For the applicants, I would encourage you to apply if you see that as a source of revenue you may need, and we'll pass that on. But, if it's something that this committee would like to stand behind and make a recommendation to town council with, we would like the opportunity to vet that as well. Make their recommendation. I don't want you to miss an opportunity to apply for those thinking that, that recommendation would not come from this committee whose purpose is to serve and provide recommendations to town council. Anything else for Mr. Gruber? Thank you very
All
much.
right, thank you very much.
Next, we're going to have the town attorney, Curtis Coltrane, if you would, please.
Yes, it is. Good one.
Mr. Coltrane is going to go over the bylaws and rules and procedures. Welcome.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Curtis Coltrane. I sometimes represent the town and do some other things, but I do a lot of work for the town. In the context of our meeting this morning, there are a couple of things that I think are very important for the new members. Obviously, the ones who have been on the committee already know how the process works.
Use the mic.
The committee does have a set of bylaws, and then here someplace, but I mean, again, if they're very straightforward. It gives you a methodology. You have to elect your officers yearly between and among yourselves. And it sets out the method for calling meetings of the committee. Aside from the members of the committee themselves, you then have your staff, which, takes care of making sure that the meetings are properly noticed and that everyone has the materials that are coming to you for the meetings. Again, your bylaws they're very straightforward. I don't really see the reason to sit there and read them to you because y'all can do that yourself. But it does have on the list here a couple of things that are sort of important. Number one, the committee can't act without a quorum of its members present. A quorum is 50% plus one, in this case, 5 members. I mean, typically, people have things happen in their lives, and oftentimes people can't appear, but as long as you have 5, you can move forward and act. The next 3 items are the things that do come up and that I think are very important for the board to have some awareness of, and they are all under the umbrella of the Freedom of Information Act. As a public body, which this organization is, you are governed by the dictates of the Freedom of Information Act in South Carolina. The text of the Freedom of Information Act is fairly dense, but what it comes down to is this. The business of this committee and any other public committee is the business of the public. And with very limited exceptions, it must take place in public. All communication by and between the members about committee business are public records. It does not matter what device that communication may take place on. If it is communication by and between members of the committee regarding the committee's business, the records are public. And what that means is that if you use your personal phone to send texts, which I say this every time I make a presentation like this, stop sending texts. It's a terrible way to communicate. It creates a records retention nightmare, and there are other ways to do it that avoid those problems. But to the extent that you do that, it's a public record if it's about committee business. And so if a question ever arises about any such communication, it's public. So what the Freedom of Information Act says is that anything you do, again, related to the committee's business is a public document, is public communication, and must either be done in public or must be disclosed to the public if anyone ever asks about it. So that is a serious, I say it's a serious question. It's a serious question because it is a real requirement that everyone is obligated to respect. I am unaware, in my own experience here, that there have ever really been any particular issues with the Freedom of Information Act, particularly among this committee and efforts to avoid it. I don't think that's happened. Don't have any reason to believe it will begin to happen now, but that is what the requirement is. So again, back to communication among committee members, again, irrespective of where it occurs, if it is about the committee's business, it is public. As the members who are on the committee already know, if a majority of the committee happens to be in the same place at the same time for whatever reason, that becomes a public meeting. If you've got a quorum, then it is a public meeting, whether it's, yes.
So earlier you said that 5 is the requirement for a quorum, and now you've said majority. Maybe you can clarify that for me, and to follow up with that,
Well,
just
in the
quick.
case of, I'm sorry, in the case of a 5-person committee, a quorum is a majority. It's 5. 7-person committee, sorry.
Right, so my question, I guess, the initial meeting, we only had 4, and we elected officers. Does that need to be redone with a quorum? Because 4 would not then be a quorum from the last meeting?
If you didn't have a quorum, yes, then you were not authorized to conduct business. So you would need to re-elect, yes. If you only had 4, you didn't have a quorum.
Okay, thank you.
But where that comes up is, and there have been cases not involving the town, not involving any committee of the town, where there have been meetings involving a majority of any given, some committee somewhere, some council somewhere, at a restaurant, at a party, at what have you. Those things become public meetings if a majority of the people are there. And what that means is that all public meetings have to be publicly noticed, 24 hours notice to everyone. If those things don't happen, you've had a violation of the Freedom of Information Act. And so you do have to avoid that sort of thing. I mean, I don't know how likely it is that 4 of you, 5 of you, 6 of you, whatever, show up at the same place at the same time, but that is something that, being members of a public body, you do have to consider. Again, is it likely? Probably not, but it is something that you have to keep in mind as you move forward with this. Again, we've already covered the fact that everything that the committee does is a public record. Communication by and between members, your official acts here at committee meetings, your minutes, the decisions that you make, all of it are public records and must be done in public. The fourth item, every meeting of a public body is open to the public with certain limited exceptions. Committees such as this, and town council, and any other town committee, are permitted to retire into executive session, meaning out of the public, to discuss certain limited things. In the context of this committee, the reason that an executive session will happen will be for the receipt of legal advice. Most of the other ones are things like personnel matters. Y'all have no personnel, you don't hire and fire people, that won't come up. If there are issues related to the conduct of a member or members, that's can come up, but then again, that would fall under probably receipt of legal advice. I mean, there just aren't too many things where this committee is going to have a reason to step away from the public's business unless there is a legal question about a particular application or how the law applies to a particular application, and the committee would like to hear that in private. Those things can be done. You are required to make a motion to go into executive session and state the reason. I mean, not, in super great detail, but enough so that the public knows what will happen. When you're in executive session, you are allowed to do what you said you were going in for. In the case of receipt of legal advice, you would receive the legal advice. Votes cannot be taken in executive session. You can't do a straw poll. You can't go around the table and see how everyone's going to vote. The vote has to be a public matter. When you say you're going into executive session for a limited reason, legal advice on application number 1, that's what you do. You get your legal advice, you retire back out here, you come back into public session, and you deal with the application in whatever manner deems appropriate to you. I mean, the rules are very broad, but they're also honestly very simple. And that is that absent the very limited reasons for which you can conduct business in executive session, every single thing that you do is public. And that sounds sort of ominous. It's really not, because this is what you do. You publish an agenda, you have the applications, you discuss the applications, you do it all. I mean, it's all as a matter of course, just like what you're doing right now. To engage in activity that is contrary to the Freedom of Information Act, requires, you have to do it deliberately. You don't accidentally have a meeting someplace else, right? So, again, the rules are, again, it can sound ominous, but they're actually very simple. And again, to my knowledge, we have never had much problem here with anyone not complying with them. Any questions?
Any questions for Mr. Cotring? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Next, we're going to have the review of the distribution of state accommodation taxes. Adriana Burnett, please. Ms. Burnett is our new finance director. If folks weren't here on our last meeting, she was introduced and gave us a quick background. She had an accurate count of how many days she had been on the island. Do you still have that count? Do you know what day it
I
is?
do
Not to
have a
put you on the
count,
spot.
and it's
Okay.
2 months now.
2 months. All right. Welcome. Thank you
Well,
for being here.
thank you. Good morning to everybody, and for those of you that I haven't met, it's a pleasure. And good morning to our members of the community as well that are here present. I love talking numbers. Numbers is one of my favorite subjects. So let me see if I can move this. Okay, I don't want to start talking about this one because I think Josh did a wonderful, excellent job talking about the different allocations. However, this one is one that I'm sure for those of you that have been present for this type of meetings, you have seen before. But I want to do this a little differently from before. I mean, I think I don't want to read to you, but I want to bring something to your attention. So we have something for 2 years that is called COVID. I don't know, I'm sure all of you remember those 2 years very well. And I want to look at this slide a little different. I want for you to think about pre-COVID and after COVID. So as you can see, pre-COVID, our revenue numbers were about 6.49, and we're talking millions here. And then once COVID started, our numbers went up. It went to 10, then it went to 13.57, and then it went up to, or it went to 13.34. So those are, I call them special years. And they're special because our aid tax, our accommodation tax, were very high during those years. We had a lot of people in our island, so our accommodation tax was very high. And notice now in 24, we have 12.79. So notice the decrease that is happening. So I want you to be aware that I know we don't have a crystal ball. We don't know what's going to happen in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. But what I'm seeing based on these numbers, I'm seeing that there is a decline. And what I'm expecting, again, this is an assumption and an estimation that these aid tax numbers are going to continue going down. I don't know the extent of how much they're going to go down, but I'm not expecting it to be, again, on the 13.57 number. I'm expecting to be either between 12 to 10, or even lower than that, and I hope that is not the case. I don't have an answer for that yet. But I want to bring that to your awareness, because as we start getting applications, there's a big chance that the numbers that we have worked with in the past are not going to be the same numbers. Right now, just to give you another example, we were expecting for our fourth quarter, we were expecting about $5.8 million, and the numbers that came from the state were about 4.7. So that's a big difference for our fourth quarter. Our estimated number was a lot higher than what we actually got. If I move to the next slide, any questions about this one?
Since 2019 really was the pre-COVID year, a full year, do you have a number for 2019?
I don't have a number here with me, but I'd be glad to give you that number and send you that information. Yes. I actually just happened to remove 2019. I didn't think it was relevant, but I'll be glad to give you the 2019 figure.
If I recall, it was around that number, maybe a little less than the 6.49, but it was in that wheelhouse, sub 10 for sure.
So I see 2025, our fiscal year 25, as our normalization year, because I think this year, 2025, is going to give us a better picture as it relates to what the number potentially is going to be going forward. Right now, our estimated number, and I know it's not reflected here, but it's about 12.8 is what we're estimating for 2025. But I'm hoping that that is the number we get. So this is the allocations that have happened during probably the last 5 years, the last 4 years. And as you can see, we have, as Josh mentioned earlier, we have some allocation for our capital improvements. The grant amount that we had for 2024, we have about $4.3 million. And then we have other things like housing and also some land acquisition too that we had in 2024. So altogether, the revenues that we expected and the actual number is about $12.7 million. Again, and this is mostly for you, for your benefit, and also for those in our community that are planning to apply. Please do not rely on the $4.2 million number. Again, the decision of this number is going to be town council. They're the ones that are going to decide what's going to be the distribution that we're going to have for this upcoming year. But I want the members of our community, and I'm not here to tell you how to run your business, but I do want you to, and I guess I'm wearing my consultant hat. I came from the consulting area. For many years, I worked as a consultant, but I want to give an advice to our members of the community and also for our committee members. As you start getting applications, for those members that are relying 100% on this grant, please don't. I need you to think about your business, your activities, the things that you're doing within your organization, and then start looking at all the processes and all the things that you're putting together, and do not put all your eggs in one basket. Make sure that you start looking at streamlining some of those activities. And I even suggest, too, that if you get 100%, great. If you get 80%, then what does that look like for 80% of the activities and your organization that you're doing? What kind of things you need to reduce to make sure you have enough money to do the activities that you are planning to do? So I want you to, the members of the community that are planning to apply for this grant, please look at your organizations. What makes sense? If you were to get 100%, great. If you don't get 100% and you get only 80% of what you used to getting, then what kind of things do you need to cut down? So those are the type of things that I want the members of the community that are planning to apply to keep in mind. Again, it might not be 4.2 at this point. It is not my decision as a finance director to make that recommendation that is going to be that amount. It could be less. But as I'm looking at numbers now and projections, things are going down. So there's a chance that it might not be 4.2 again this year. We will give you more information, committee members, as we continue our analysis, as we continue talking to town council of what that number is going to be, so we can report that to our community. One thing, and this is only for information purposes, this is for those of you that are new to our committee. This is what some of the organizations over the years that we have provided grants that you have approved and the council has approved. This is only for informational purposes. We might get the same organizations, or we might get new ones. But this is the award that has been granted over the years. And this is, again, is for you to understand what has happened. And this information, of course, is open to the public, and anybody that has any questions or any follow-up as it relates to grants, as it relates to what has been granted in the past, please let us know. Again, please do again, managing expectations here as it relates to the money that we are expecting is potentially is not going to be the same amount that we've been getting year after year, especially now that we are outside COVID. So, any questions, comments?
If you look at that 15% that is going to go towards housing most likely every year, is that money that you foresee impacting the ability for these organizations to have their normal grant levels?
So as you can see on this slide here, this is our distribution that we do. The cap is 15%. It doesn't mean that we are going to spend 50%. It depends on what council decides to do as it relates to workforce housing. But the cap is 50%. So so the goal here is that if we're getting a decrease in our revenue that we're collecting, then that decrease will be split among all the different areas that we allocate the money to.
So outside of the increase in capital improvements, you would see the housing as possibly eating into that other grant money?
Again, it's going to be a distribution according to what our revenue is and according to the opportunities that we as a community see as it relates to workforce housing. I would like to say that we will be distributing the same amount of money year after year, but that's not going to be the case. It's going to be a percentage, an allocation percentage based on the revenue that we get.
Do you foresee this particular year will be able to reach that normal grant?
I think this year will be a year of, I call it normalization, because it's going to give us a better view of what that revenue might come back as. Considering that we are still in the high of COVID, and now we see that the revenue that is coming from the state is down. So I think 2025 is going to give you a better perspective of what to expect in the upcoming years. Yes, to answer your question, yes, I think 2025 is going to be the year to have a better view of revenues.
In the past, when you look at this particular chart, if you go back to 2020, you don't see any money spent on capital improvements. Was that because it wasn't pre-budgeted and it was usually money that was left over and then they went and found the capital improvements that they wanted to do?
Yeah, so Josh mentioned something that sometimes we have a surplus, and that surplus amount is a 2-year surplus amount that we have to use within 2 years. So again, this is based on council and what they decide to do with the funding. I'm assuming that since I wasn't here in those years, I'm assuming that there were projects that were identified during 2023 and 2024 that require financing from this tax. So, yes.
Okay, thank you.
One question, if I could. Do you anticipate having a date of when we'll know how much is available to applicants?
Yes.
See, before we make our recommendations, obviously that's a number we'll need to know. Do you
Yes.
know when that might be? What time of the year?
Yes, so we're hoping if it doesn't happen in September, it will happen in October for sure. So you committee members will have that information with you, because you need to understand what information, what numbers you need to work with. So yes, you will get that information, hopefully if not in September, in October.
That would be prior to our recommendations to town council.
Right.
Have a number to work with. Thank you. Any other questions?
Follow up on Martin's question, the 15% that is available for workforce housing is going to come from the town side. Is it your expectation that the allocation of funds to this committee will be reduced by 15%? That might to the town side?
No, I don't think it will.
4.2 being reduced by 15%, is that a possibility or no?
No, I don't, 15% is a big percentage. The goal here is to look at the revenue. So we're looking at the revenue and looking at what is the decrease year after year for revenue. So let's assume that decrease is 8%. So the question is, how do we pass that 8% decrease among all the different things that we are allocating? Of course, we have a state mandate that we have to keep the 30% for DMO. So there's some state requirements that we have to abide by. So those percentages cannot be reduced because they're low. But as it relates to the other allocations and the other costs that we have, The idea here is that if we have a decrease in revenue by 8%, that there's a chance that the other items that we allocate monies to will also have a decrease. Yes.
What, I mean, I know you're kind of new to this position, but would you know historically when the last time, or if there was a time when all the grants could not be funded? All the applications could not, all the approved applications could not be funded?
I'm sorry, but I don't have an answer to that other than looking at what we have here back to 2020, and I see there's an amount here of 2.6, and it's a lot lower than what we're funding right now, which is 4.2. I don't know the answer to that. That would probably be a question for.
But in your opinion, you foresee that possibly happening in the next year or two?
I don't foresee that happening because there's still going to be revenue that we will be getting. It's just the amount of revenue that we will get. I think as part of the town and as part of our role is to make sure that our community is doing and supporting our activities and supporting the tourists and the visitors and everybody that is coming to our island. So I don't see that amount disappearing for good, because then that will handicap our job as a town and as a community to support the visitors and bring revenue and help businesses with that revenue. So I don't see that happening. But again, that's a town council decision, not an Adriana decision. So if it's Adriana, I would say it should not be disappearing, because I think it helps our community and it helps our organizations within the community.
Okay,
But then again, town council they have the final say, so.
As my memory serves me, when we met in the fall of 2019, going into the 2020 funding cycle, there were more requests than what was available to spend. And we did have to go through and make adjustments on recommendations, so there was a delta in that. Once we got into the fall of 2020 and revenues were coming in for the 2020 year as we're funding 2021, that's when we saw this jump where you went from 6.4 to 10. And so that's kind of where we ended up, where eligible applicants had the ability to be funded without us having to shave edges.
I know that was about the year you came on to the committee, but was that common before that?
I believe so. The prior year, it was the same way. I can't speak prior to that, but I believe the year before was the same thing. That committee had to go through, and I'll use round numbers. Somebody requested 10,000, and they ended up with 9. So we'll go through, make recommendations to everyone, and make adjustments where it would be in order for us to make a recommendation to town council to fall underneath of what is available. But again, we're still in high numbers. Even this year is a downfall. I mean, things are coming back to a norm as we anticipated they would. It's still a significant amount of revenue coming through. I believe last year we were well under what was available in our recommendations. It's just the great unknown right now as we kind of tail back into normal.
And one thing that we as a finance department here for the town, one of the things that we want to continue and start doing to some extent is looking at our numbers and creating more analytics about our numbers, so we're in a better position to forecast and do projections. So right now it is difficult to anticipate what that's going to look like. Again, we're hoping that our island maintains the economic conditions that we had for many years, where we are very fortunate to have visitors and to have great businesses that are doing good work and the organizations that we are supporting. So I'm hoping that it will be something not as drastic as what we saw pre-COVID, but again, we don't have that analytics and that information yet to be able to make a better assumption to that, so.
Mr. Chairman, just as a comment, we say that it's normalizing, but in 2020, we were at 6.4, and now we're looking at 12.7.
It's
These
going
are
down.
high-class problems, I guess. And
Yes.
And what we encourage our applicants to do as a group is to ask for what they need versus what they'd like. And we always feel respected, I think almost is the word, to where they're asking for what they must have to keep going, and not to keep the doors open, as you spoke to earlier. But I still feel like it's a high-class problem for us I think when we're talking about in 2024, the prospect was for to be in the $12 million range. it's still almost double what it was in 2020.
Yes, it's still almost double. Again, I don't think the drop is going to happen overnight. Again, I think 2025 is going to be a good year for us to see which direction we're going as it relates to this. We're hoping that we can, again, this is based on the tourists and the visitors and the people that stay in the many hotels in different areas. So as we maintain, and hopefully we will maintain where we are today, there's still me getting familiar with the economy of this island, understanding the different metrics and the different things that we can use to measure. But right now, based on what we're getting, the actual numbers and the payments that we're receiving from the state, I see a trajectory of going down. Right now, I calculate that as being 8% down. Again, 2025 is going to give us hopefully a better vision of what that number potentially is going to be in the next few years. But you're right, we're here as a town and you as committee members to support our organizations and our community. Yes.
The 8% that you referenced, is that occupancy or is that the tax dollars?
We're talking about the tax dollars, the actual revenue, yes. Any other comments, questions?
Any other questions?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next on the agenda, Ms. Shana Smith, the Finance Assistant. She's going to review the meeting schedule with us for 2024, 2025. Good morning.
Good morning. You've all seen the timeline in our schedule of meetings, but just to briefly go over it, the season kind of kicks off in April. The chamber is our designated marketing organization, so that's when they'll come and present their marketing plan to us. July 18th, that's when we welcomed our new board members, and the application became available August 5th. So giving the applicants a little bit of time to look things over before we do our workshop in the middle of August at some point. September 6th, that's an important date. That's the deadline. We'll probably say that multiple times today. The audience will hear it. That's the due date for grant applications, 4 p.m., September 6th. I believe that's a Friday. So we still have plenty of time. And October 7th is when we'll meet to review some of those applications. We'll go over some schedules for the hearings, and we'll also kind of go over some schedules for next year as well. The hearing dates are October 17th and the 24th. Those will be full-day events with the organizations presenting their events and projects. And then November 7th, that's when we'll meet together for the last time to kind of distribute those funds and figure out what you'll be recommending to town council. I want to switch gears a little bit, really address the applicants. So committee members, please flag me down if you want to interrupt or ask questions at any point. But this is really for our returning applicants, our new applicants. All of this information is on our website, of course, and it's on the application as well. But I'm Shana Smith. I'll be the one that you'll be contacting for any questions about what's necessary for the application. If you're not sure about attachments, if you're not sure about what's going to qualify, anything along the context of the application. Renee is going to be your person who's doing everything behind the scenes online. She's our web developer. She is very good with returning emails quickly, so anytime there's issues with not being able to attach something or something is not saving correctly, you're not sure if you submitted it, anything along those lines, she can go behind the scenes and help out. But I do have lots of great tips from her that I wanted to go over, just with the technical aspect of the application. When you're registering all the new applicants, will want to create your, there'll be a place where you can register, and I'll pull that up so you guys know exactly where it's located on the site. But you're gonna wanna use a generic name. This is something that's gonna carry over each year, so keep years out of it. That'll also help with some things that will carry over, like financials that you attach to the application, make things a little bit easier. So anything generic is fine. And returning applicants, you'll keep all of your normal logins. If you don't have it, Renee is who you'll contact for that. For those that are taking new positions within your organization, and you're not sure of what it was before, don't create a new organization. Renee will set you up to use the existing one. That way, again, those things, financial documents, everything can carry over. The presentations are scheduled for October 17th and the 24th, and we have kind of just a generic 9 to 5 schedule that's on the website right now, but potentially that could be longer depending on the applicants. So those are long days. You'll be hearing from me where we'll actually schedule those. And I'll give everyone exactly when their times are. But if people have dates that they can't go, you already know you won't be here on the 17th or the 24th. Maybe you have preferences for going first or last on a particular day. Email me those as soon as you can. We will try to meet all of those requests. They are just requests. We can't guarantee it. Obviously, I can't have everyone go on the same day, but we'll do our best. But again, it'll just be through email, and that'll be my contact. Some of Renee's technical tips that I was talking about. She suggests you save frequently. They will save automatically when you go page to page, but it's a good habit to get into, especially if you're in the middle of a long narrative. It will time out eventually, but I think it's like an 8-hour window. So really that would only apply if you guys are ending the day, doing a long narrative, and then wait for the morning, and at that point it would have timed out and you will have lost everything. So just save, save, save. Formatting can be an issue when you're copying and pasting. They're little text box. Some of them are 100-word max, some of them are 250. But if you're doing everything in a Word document and you're copying and pasting it over, there's a lot of background code that affects that word count. So Renee suggests you use some sort of any sort of notebook editor. Those are going to actually strip the formatting, so you shouldn't have any issues. We've already had some applicants have issues with that, things are disappearing. Something as just even the font that you use, bold, italics. If you're using bullet points, you're welcome to do those things, but just remember that could affect your overall word count within those text boxes. One of the other tips is downloading a copy. Once you finish your application, there will be an option to download a copy for yourself. I highly recommend you do that. You'll find that it will be helpful before your presentations, and usually right before the presentations, that's when Renee gets lots of requests for those, and she gets bogged down a little bit. So save them. You'll want to refer to them, and that's where all your questions are coming from with the committee members as well. And again, that deadline is September 6th, 4 p.m. And at that point, everything will be taken down from the website, so you won't be able to actually pull it back up again. If you submit it prior to that, you still have a way to access it by logging in, and you can pull it up at that point. But at the 4 p.m. deadline, that's when you won't be able to pull it up anymore. So save yourself a copy. Some things to ask yourself that we've noticed with some previous applications that might help. Is your organization geographically located in the municipality of Hilton Head? If your event's on Tufusky, in Bluffton, maybe there's a little bit of a fine line there. Really with This grant is going to be geographically located on Hilton Head. Does your grant request match your budget? As Josh mentioned earlier, this is a reimbursement program, so you'll want to make sure that that future budget that you're presenting in your application matches what you're asking for. It could mean that you're asking for, your budget shows that you're spending money, but are you spending it on what you're requesting? Are you spending it on marketing? Are you spending it on something else that doesn't actually match up to the amount that you're asking for? These are the little things that they're going to be asking questions about during the presentation. Tourists. Josh mentioned this several times, tourism-related expenditures. That's what this grant is for. So that's what we really want to know about your organization is how you're impacting or benefiting that. And also, how do you know? Is this a survey? Is this a QR code that people are downloading? How are you tracking that? Some people sell tickets and people actually have to put in addresses and it makes it really easier, and other things aren't quite as black and white. So they're going to want to know, and they're going to want to have documentation on how you're presenting those numbers to them. And the application deadline again. 4 p.m. Friday, September 6th. And I have all of this information on flyers that you can take. They're all in the back. This has my information on it, Renee's information on it, your presentation dates, and your application deadline again. Like I said, I do want to actually pull up where your application is going to live on the website. And I've made sort of a test one as well, but we'll see if we can log in. The town website has a spotlight section, so it's right here on your homepage, and this is where it'll live until 4 p.m., September 6th. Thank you. Once you pull it up and you actually begin your application process, this is where it's going to ask you to actually register as a first-time applicant or do your username and password. And again, Renee will give this to you if you don't have it already. If you have multiple events, or you have previously, and some people do, there'll be a list here. I've only created one test, but some people do have applications for more than one. And you can create a new one or go into your existing. This is going to break it down for you, and the easiest way going through, and you have questions, you actually have a link and your resources all on your left side. The application guidelines, this is going to be your best friend, and they have links to it on each page of the application. So any questions that come up as far as what may be asked of the organization, go into the guidelines first. That may answer your question, but I'm available telephone, email, in person. I can help as well. And if I don't know the answer, I will find someone who does. But this is basically going through all of the summary of your grant requests, the purpose of your grant requests, how you're going to determine your tourists, what is a tourist, your visitors, your residents. When it asks about patrons served, what is it asking for? It's asking for all three of those. This is breaking it down in the most simplest format. The description of your operations, this is where you're gonna put in your percentages, and you're gonna want them to equal 100%. You have links in here to resources as well to the state website. At some point it does ask for your procurement guidelines and you know how it is that you're purchasing goods for your operations. That's in here as well. If you're wondering what exactly that means and how does it compare to the town's procurement guidelines, we have our standard operating procedure listed in here as well. You also have an ATAX effectiveness form, and this is an attachment for you to use if you want to. But that will narrow it down for you if you're wondering what to include. You can use ours or you can use something else. I will say with the attachments within the application, it was new last year, but you weren't able to submit your application without attaching something that requires an attachment. If you have questions about, hey, is this necessary? I don't actually have something for this. It might be a case of actually attaching a statement saying that. So if you have questions about that, let me know. Not everything is cut and dry, but that's why we're here for questions. Application guidelines will go through all the way up until measuring your effectiveness, how you've used ATAX grants in the past if you're returning applicants, your executive summary, financial guarantees and procedures. Make sure all your financial documents are not password protected. We've had that before. These are public documents. You can actually look on our website and look at previous applications that you and other organizations have submitted, and that could potentially be a resource as well. But yes, this will all be public on our website. You have a code of laws in there as well that Josh went over. And that's pretty much it. But if you have issues, I'm gonna have a seat, but if anyone wants to come up to the podium with questions, now's your time to do so, and then that way we can hear you. And if you don't feel comfortable doing that, you can get with me afterwards or via phone or email as well.
Can I just speak loudly?
Of course.
What time do you want us to use for our presentations? Last year was 5 minutes. Are we sticking with that?
It'll really depend, most likely we will be sticking with that. And a lot of it will also depend on how many applicant submissions that we have. Sometimes those are longer days than we think, but we start a little earlier and a little bit later. We should at least be able to give everyone their 5 minutes and get some breaks in there too at some point. But yes, you'll have schedules that I will send out to everyone that shows their times. That won't be a surprise.
So I'm a little confused about the discussion that Josh had regarding capital expenditures versus cultural and tourism expenditures. Last year, it was very clear that capital expenditures, I'm not talking about building buildings, but certain capital-related expenditures were part of, if you had those, you could request a grant. If I remember correctly, that may be also part of the legal framework. But the way Josh presented it, we shouldn't do that.
Let's,
So
let
that's
me be
why now
unequivocally clear.
I need to forget this.
Nope, let me be unequivocally clear. I am not saying anybody should not apply. That is not what I'm saying. If you've applied before, please feel free to apply again. What I was providing was an example of the Tourism Expenditure Review Committee, in their mind, setting different standards for how they're going to review requests. And so it was just an example for illustrative purposes. I am not communicating with any applicant, past, prior, or future, as to whether you should or should not apply. Each application is independently reviewed based upon the very specific facts and circumstances of what you put in your application. So please take it to mean that apply if you want to seek these funds. That is the best advice that I can give you. Work? All right.
It's about the capital.
Okay.
Okay. You said not to apply. Of course, Steve graciously told us to go ahead if we have any capital replacement or improvement related to tourism, and it has to be demonstrated.
Your
So
definition
There's a lot
of-
of confusion here, too.
Your definition of capital may be different than my definition of capital. My definition of capital talks about building buildings. That's what that section spoke to in terms of coliseums, civic centers, tourism-related facilities.
Okay.
I'm not talking about capital as in you're doing repairs or maintenance of different projects. You may call that capital, but for me, that's not the definition that I'm applying.
Okay.
So what I'm talking about is constructing buildings, and we've had applications come in before. We've seen requests, not this past year, but in the years prior, about funding workforce housing. And what I can tell you is town council has said they want to take that up through a different process where they will work directly with those applicants to talk about building actual structures. So again, please know, apply, especially if you've applied and been given funding before, there's no reason not to apply. I was just giving you an example of what the Turk's role is in looking at those requests and providing guidance on what they think is appropriate and not appropriate.
Is there a difference between capital and capital improvement then, is what you're talking about most likely?
Let me leave it at this, apply. I'm not gonna sit here and try to come up with every explanation of what can or cannot happen. Apply. We'll look at the details of it and we'll work with you on responding to it.
Put it in A or B.
That's it.
Don't build a building.
Well, you can't put it in A or B, you'd have to get a different.
Again, whatever you think is appropriate, make the request, and once it's in, we'll work with you on the very specific details of that, both with the committee and with staff, on how we go ahead about processing that.
Thank you. Again, apply. If you've had it in the previous years, please apply, and we'll take it up. We'll review that. So
Even if there's a $10,000 ask, 3 of it might be for promotion, a percentage of it might be for some type of capital improvement, because very often the total amount is not for one particular function, it's for multiple causations, right? So the summary is apply, and then let us review it, because ultimately we submit it to town council for approval, so apply.
So if your group has multiple activities during the year that they're thinking of, do you recommend that they be combined into one application, or should each event or project be a separate application?
Typically, if it's multiple smaller ones, it's within one application. I think there's just a few that are like biannual large events. But small events throughout the year, those are typically consolidated into one. You don't have to worry about each one. Again, grab one of these on your way out. If you haven't pulled up the application yet, I highly encourage you to do so. The 24 hours before the application is due, that's usually our busiest time, and of course we want to get back to you, so that doesn't fall into our deadline. Thank you.
thank you, Ms. Smith. Just to follow up on that, we ask that you get these in as soon as you can. It takes a lot of work from the staff to put everything together. If you're waiting to the last minute, you're just jeopardizing the opportunity for us to make a recommendation to town council to fund it. Don't make it harder on the staff than it already is. There's 40 applicants usually. The sooner you can get it in, the better. You may have holes in it that they're going to send back to you and say, hey, you're missing this. You need some time in there, some wiggle room to make sure that what you're submitting is most suitable for you. Thank you for all the town staff today for these covering all these things for us. Next, I'd like to open up for committee decision.
I was just going to ask, those people, particularly those who are new, or those organizations who are doing something meaningfully different in their activities for the year, somewhere in there, please try to highlight what has changed and what's going on. Sometimes we'll go back and look at history and consider that in terms of the grants, but if we do really understand that you're doing something different, it's helpful to have an explanation from you before the presentation period.
Thank you. Open up for committee discussion. I would like to take up the conversation we had about meeting quorum on the 18th. I believe by Robert's Rule of Order, a quorum for 7 is 4, and we did have 4 present. It's majority. It's only on an even number that you would have majority plus 1.
Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, I want to make sure I'm correct in saying that. I'm happy to take up what we covered in the last meeting. That was my understanding. Mr. Cochran, if you can elaborate on that. I believe quorum is
for 7 is 4. But I could be wrong. I believe on an even number, when you have 6, then it would be 3 plus 1.
I was not hired for my math skills. But you are correct. Four is a quorum of 7. That is my mistake, and I apologize for
That's
that.
okay. Thank you. I was afraid I'd already messed up in meeting 1, so. Any other discussions?
Yes, I'd like to mention that in the workshop, I know Beaufort County has made the workshop mandatory for all applicants. I would like the committee to at least consider making it mandatory for all new applicants to attend that workshop so that we know that the applications we're receiving are all in line with what they should be. We had some problems last year, I know, and I think it would be beneficial, not only for us, but for the people applying, especially new people applying.
I would recommend you bring that up when we go into next year's application process to make sure that if that's something that this committee would request, that we put that in for the application as well.
Okay.
I believe as it stands right now, that's not written into the requirements for you to attend the workshop, although it is very beneficial and very much so encouraged, but I agree with you, it would be beneficial to all parties.
It will also be something that now can be accessed through video now that our committee meetings are live streamed and recorded. So it's now something that people can go back to if they don't attend, which is a benefit.
Is there any way any of that workshop can be Zoom? People can participate remotely, or no?
For this
For the workshop,
this workshop.
yeah.
For those watching virtually to comment and make questions, is that your question?
Potentially, we can move that to a discussion for next year's workshop.
Okay.
Any other discussions? Is there a motion to adjourn? Is there a second? Thank you, folks. Have a great day.